Hey everyone. Today we're going to dive into something that seems simple at first glance, categorization, but is actually surprisingly rich and complicated. Have you ever wondered why your mental cat category never includes your neighbor's vacuum cleaner, even though both make noise and move around? Well, maybe you haven't, but you do probably have a cat file in your brain that instantly tells you that Fluffy next door belongs there. But what does it really mean to be a cat? And why did your mind put the animal in the cat box instead of, say, Martian spaceship? Stick around as we explore how our brains draw these invisible circles around ideas, and what happens when our circles don't line up with someone else's. Okay, picture this. Let's say we've got a bunch of characters, some superheroes, some supervillains, and we want to sort them into groups. You know, truth, justice, and moral high ground versus dramatic lighting and suspiciously good theme music. One way to do this is by plotting them on a graph using a couple of features. Wait a minute, what's a feature, you ask? Well, a feature is any measurable characteristics you can use to describe something. Think of it like a slider, a checkbox, or a dial that tells you about the thing in question. For example, number of legs is a feature. Works for people, dogs, or millipedes. Although, millipedes really run away with that one. You know, because they have a lot of legs. Anyway, features can be numbers like height, speed, or number of dramatic speeches delivered per week, or categories like color, species, or favorite snack. If you can rate it, compare it, or observe it, it's probably a feature. So, in this case, we've picked two features, goodness and monologue frequency. And look what happens. Two neat clusters. The heroes over here, doing good, mostly, and the villains over there, talking a lot. So what do features do for us? Ideally, they help us tell things apart. They let us draw boundaries between different kinds of stuff, like a cat and a vacuum cleaner. So, what we can do is we compare values on a few key features, like fuzziness, height, and emotionally unavailable but will scream if ignored, and we can draw a clear line between them. But sometimes, very different things can share the same feature. So let's see what happens when that's the case. So what happens when different things share the same feature? Let's take an example. Let's compare a baseball bat and a baguette. One is hard, difficult to chew, and mostly used as a blunt force weapon. The other is a baseball bat. I'm hilarious, I know. But, do you see the problem? If you pick features that aren't actually good at distinguishing between categories, you end up grouping things together that absolutely do not belong. And, what's even more interesting is we can actually mathematically describe this kind of joke. I know. What's funnier than explaining a joke? Explaining it with math. Here's how the trick works. Start by picking a few categories that are obviously different. Let's say food, toys, and tools. Then, choose a few features they happen to share, but that are misleading. These shared traits might make them seem more similar than they really are. Now, let's see what that looks like in our new feature space. Neat, right? Now look at the bottom right. Notice our baguette and baseball bat now end up in the same circle. You may not think this is the best joke, but it is a perfect example of what happens when you pick bad features. Let's take a look back at our superhero graph, but let's pick some new features. Now, if you're trying to tell heroes from villains, this graph is pretty useless. We can see there seems to be no easy way to separate heroes from villains, as they're all tangled up. But, if you're an insurance company, suddenly this is exactly what you need. These features, power level, and property damage per battle, are perfect for figuring out who's going to bankrupt you next year. Want to calculate your downtown premiums? Just check how close your apartment is to someone who can bench press a train and doesn't believe in collateral damage. At this point, we're not classifying good guys and bad guys, we're building a disaster pricing model. And this cluster right here, congratulations, that's your please move to the suburbs tier. So this isn't a failure, it's a reminder. The usefulness of a feature depends entirely on the question you're asking. Let's say we're trying to figure out what kind of drink something is. Is it meant for adults? Is it more of a kid's drink? We'll start with two measurable features, sweetness and fizziness. Not a bad first guess. Most kid-friendly drinks are sweet and bubbly. Adult drinks, usually less sweet, maybe still fizzy but with a kick. At first, it looks like things might be working out. Our Shirley Temple and grape soda are hanging out in the top right, sweet and fizzy. Meanwhile, the IPA and kombucha are tucked into bottom left, drier and more subdued. But then we get to the middle, and everything falls apart. Hard lemonade, sparkling grape juice, wine coolers. Suddenly, the boundaries get blurry. What started as a tidy chart becomes a tangled mess. So how do we fix this? One option is to throw out our current features and try a different set altogether. But another approach is to keep what we have and add more information to the picture. Let's see what happens if we add another feature. Graphically, this is the same as adding another axis, a new dimension in our feature space. It's like pulling the graph upwards into a new direction. Suddenly, we're not just looking at sweetness and fizziness, we're adding alcohol content into the mix. That's more data. But is it better data? Just because we've added a dimension doesn't mean we've added anything useful. If the new axis actually helps us separate our categories, if it pulls adult drinks into their own region, then we haven't just made a chart fancier, we've added information. But if nothing changes, if the adult and child drinks are still tangled together, then the new axis didn't help. We've added data, yes, but we haven't added clarity. And that's the difference between information and noise. Information is data that changes how we see the world. In other words, it updates our internal model of reality. It gives us sharper boundaries, better predictions, and smarter decisions. Here's one way to think about it. Imagine you check the weather every morning, and it always says sunny. That's not wrong, and yes, it technically increases your confidence that today will be sunny. But you've already assumed that. That's your default model. So even though it's new data, it doesn't really change anything. You don't pack differently, you don't make new plans, your expectations stay the same. That's not information, that's confirmation. Now, imagine one day it says severe thunderstorms at 2. That's unexpected. It contradicts your default model. And suddenly, everything shifts. You grab an umbrella, you cancel your hike, you change your behavior. That's information. Not just because it was surprising, because it was surprising in a useful way. This is critical. It's not just about contradicting expectations. It's about doing so in an actionable way. For example, let's compare this to flipping a coin. Let's say you expect heads and you get tails. That's surprising, sure. But does it help you make better predictions next time? Not really. This is a random event. You can't use this new data to make more accurate predictions in the future because there is no relationship, or we could say statistically a correlation, between this coin flip and all future flips. It doesn't update your model in a meaningful way. It doesn't help you act differently. That's the difference. Information is surprise that matters. Noise is anything that fails to update your internal model, whether it's surprising but useless, or predictable and redundant. Let's take a look back at our drink graph. Does adding a new axis give us more information, or is it just noisy data? Well, in this case, this new feature clearly helps us separate the categories we're interested in. It lets us see something we couldn't see before by reshaping our boundaries. And here's the cool part. This doesn't have to stop at 3 features. We can't visualize anything past 3D, but we can still work in spaces with dozens or even hundreds of dimensions. Each new feature adds another layer of meaning, another way to group, compare, and draw sharper boundaries. The more relevant features we add, the clearer the picture becomes. Even if we can't see it, the math still can. So far, we've been acting like everything fits into just one category. But in real life, categories are messy. They overlap, they bleed together. Because in complicated feature spaces, our categories aren't just these little clean circles. They're these messy blobs. And those blobs, they bump into each other. Let's zoom in into the soup circle and see what's going on. Inside, we start to see subgroups, smaller, tighter categories. Same feature space, but more specific boundaries. Take butternut squash soup as an example. It's a soup, yes, but it's also a blended soup and a vegetable soup. Each one of those is just a smaller circle, drawn inside a bigger one. So one thing can live in multiple valid groups at once. That's not a failure of categorization. That's just, well, life with more than two dimensions. And since butternut squash is in both, we know these subgroups overlap. Because again, real life is messy. And here's something that's really cool. This directly translates into the idea of being more specific. When someone says, hey, can you be more specific? What they're actually asking is, draw a smaller circle in your feature space for me. In the same vein, when someone asks you to be more general, what they're asking is make your circle bigger. Isn't that so cool? And it's kind of amazing. This thing we do all the time in daily conversation, being more specific, actually has a precise geometric meaning. So the next time you're being specific, just know you're doing geometry with your words. And honestly, I think that's kind of beautiful. Have you ever explained something to someone and you thought you were being perfectly clear, but they ended up completely misunderstanding you? Why does that happen? Here's the cool part. We can actually mathematically describe what's going on. Let's break it down. Let's try defining something simple. A table. What's the difference between a table and a chair? You can place things on a chair, but that doesn't make it a table. Now, what if the table's missing a leg? 2 legs? What if it's chopped into pieces? At what point does it stop being a table and start just being wood? Let's try to understand the problem with an example. Meet Fred the table. At first, Fred is clearly a table. Sturdy, stable, perfectly qualified for holding stuff. But then things change. Fred loses a leg. Then another. Eventually, he's wobbling, propped up by optimism and a stack of takeout menus. At some point, he crosses some invisible line. Is he still a table? Or has he drifted into something else? You might still call him a table, but your friend might not. That disagreement doesn't come from the object itself, but from where each of you draws the boundary. One of you has a bigger circle, or maybe a circle in a different place. We call that a boundary disagreement. It's not about the name. It's about the shape and placement of the category itself. And just like Fred's remaining legs, our definitions aren't always aligned. So that brings us back to our question. When does something switch categories? When did Fred stop being a table? In our feature space, the answer is clear. It doesn't. Categories are things we draw. They're not an inherent part of our feature space. There's no magical moment when the table flips into being not a table, just a slow drift through the feature space. Categories are abstractions, not rules. We group things based on similarity, not secret labels embedded in the objects themselves. But our brains don't like tracking hundreds of different features. So, instead of juggling dimensions, we simplify. We draw circles. We say, everything in this region is a table. Everything outside isn't. The catch? Those circles are arbitrary. We don't all draw them in the same place. We can talk about those debates everyone loves to have. Is a hot dog a sandwich? Is cereal a soup? Is Pluto a planet? They sound trivial, and to some extent they really are. But here's something really cool. They're not random. They're actually boundary disagreements. What we're doing is asking, where should we draw the line? What belongs inside the circle and what doesn't? And since these boundaries are flexible and subjective and shaped by our own personal experiences, we all draw them a little bit differently. So, the next time your friend says, obviously a hot dog isn't a sandwich, you can smile and say, we appear to be having a feature space boundary disagreement. Though, to be fair, I spend my free time talking about math. So maybe take my social advice with a multi-dimensional grain of salt. For anyone still here, thank you. I appreciate it and it means a lot. If you guys enjoyed this, consider liking and subscribing. It really helps out. Until then, I'll see you next time.